I'm pleased to chair this session on science advice in situations of crisis. Now, crisis, whether they're man-made disasters, whether they're natural events, whatever they might be, are a fact of life. So we're not going to get away from them. And I would say that science has a very important role to play. We heard this already in some of the discussion this morning, in how we provide scientific advice and what we do. So a very important role, because scientists help in providing the knowledge, in assessing the risks and pointing out the uncertainty in situations as they unravel, to be able to translate what's happening from specialist information and to translate that to the non-specialists who are normally our policymakers and our politicians. Scientists are often trusted, varying degrees of trust, I know, and I thought that was an interesting comment, that if you're from a young, newly independent country, politicians are very highly trusted, but that isn't the case in some other areas. Scientists generally, they might fluctuate in level of trust, but generally they are trusted. And actually, what would the alternatives be? What do you do in situations of advice if you don't have chief scientific advisors? And I'll just mention one thing, because it's interesting in the context of crisis. At the moment, we do have a very serious issue regarding the Ebola virus. And just very recently, in Nigeria, in Lagos, the governor of Lagos, which is home to 20 million people in Lagos, the governor of Lagos appointed a rumour manager. Okay, so that's the title of the role. And the reason for appointing a rumour manager is because either through folklore or through preachers, local people have been taking kola nuts and using kola nuts because they've been told that this will protect them against the Ebola virus. For religious reasons, they've not been giving up their family members who are suffering from the symptoms because they think they'll never see them again if they do that. And so this has caused real problems. So the governor of Lagos decided to appoint a rumour manager. Now, he was approached by a close colleague of mine and asked why he didn't appoint a chief scientific advisor or a scientific advisor, maybe in addition to a rumour manager, because a rumour manager could be a social scientist, which could be very helpful in this context. Actually, that didn't sound so good, but you know what I mean. The expertise could be social science, which would be very valuable. Nobody wants to be called a rumour manager, but... And what the governor of Lagos said was, well, if I appointed a scientific advisor, what would I do with them afterwards? They wouldn't be any good now or any use. So actually, I think that's interesting, and it highlights to me that there is an important role. Now, what we are doing on this panel is that I'm going to give you an example of where I was involved in emergency and how it worked out and what I thought was valuable. And I'm joined here by an excellent panel. I'll introduce them when they come to speak, but each one of us is going to take a different example of an issue and how science advice was very helpful and useful. And then we'll throw it open to the floor for comment and discussion. So let me just start with science advice in an emergency and a crisis. And this is not an example for when I was Chief Scientific Advisor at the European Commission, which is now, but my previous role as Chief Scientific Advisor in Scotland, which is a devolved government within the UK. And this was the eruption of the volcano in Iceland in 2010, and I'll give it a go, Eyjafjallajökull. Any Icelandic people here? Well, then in that case, that was actually a perfect pronunciation. You have to take it from me. So we had an eruption in 2010, and volcanoes erupt all the time, don't they? So ministers didn't really pay much attention to this. But actually, I should just say why Scotland was particularly interested is because if you look at how the the flow of the atmospheric flow of ash from the volcano, it was actually coming directly across to Scotland, and Scotland was one of the first airspaces hit by the dust from the volcano. And Scotland, although it's a small country, it's the European centre of the oil and gas industry, and so there's a lot of international business going particularly through Scottish airspace in that area, so of big economic concern. When the airspace was closed down, our ministers and our First Minister in Scotland got very upset and said, this is ridiculous because volcanoes do erupt all the time. Why is there a problem? So I had to find out very quickly about, because I'm not a volcanologist, I'm a molecular biologist, why the problem with volcanic ash, and from this volcano in particular. So here's volcanic ash under the microscope. The gaps are air spaces that are glassified, if you like, by the silicon material from the volcano as it erupts. And so it means that this is very light, and it can also melt very quickly again, so very dispersible, and also can melt very quickly. Here's a modern jet engine. Now, all of this information I got almost instantaneously from the British Geological Survey, who do work a lot on volcanoes and volcanology, and they had experts actually in Scotland, where there is an office of the British Geological Survey, as well as my colleagues who were in Nottingham in England, who are the main base of BGS. Now, I didn't know this before, but modern jet engines fly, and for the nervous travellers amongst you, I'm sorry for what I'm about to say, but modern jet engines, they fly efficiently at a temperature above the melting temperature of the metal components of the engine, okay? So on the face of it, that sounds a little bit difficult, because so why aren't they just melting off the wings? Well, because engineers are incredibly clever, and they have designed a cooling system. So once the engine is under load and going through the air, the cooling system through the veins of the little, I'm a biologist, I think of them as capillaries, but they're actually called stator veins, going through the engine, that cools the engine down below the melting temperature of the metal. Success. So we have then an effective modern jet engine. However, if you've got volcanic ash being drawn into those cooling veins, the ash goes in there and melts and solidifies in the veins, and therefore prevents efficient cooling. Now, you know where this is going, and so did the ministers in Scotland. So they went from being very, very bellicose and angry about this is ridiculous and it's scientists being just completely crazy and all the rest of it, to thinking, oh, because I wouldn't want to be on the plane that had the engine like this. This is the blockage of the cooling systems, but we also have, because if you remember back to that electron microscopy of the volcanic ash, it's also very abrasive. So it's coming into the engine and can actually break off some of the engine parts. And you can see here where you've got whole blades which have been fractured and broken off. These are images from planes that flew through ash plumes. So this was the problem. So here there is now risk and uncertainty. How long would you have to fly through the ash cloud before this actually happened and you endangered the lives of the passengers? So now this becomes a judgment. And this is where science advice is very, very helpful to understand what's being done to try and reduce uncertainty. This is modelling that was used, and here's JRC again. I'm not deliberately plugging them, but yesterday we saw data about methane production per head, and that was a JRC database. Here is JRC modelling, and this time it's modelling from Iceland to look to see where is the plume and the concentrations of ash, where are we going to see the maximum amount of ash, and in which parts of Europe and beyond. So this was very useful to understand who was going to be exposed. And so, as a precautionary principle, there was closure of European airspace. So in the absence of sufficient information, there was closure of airspace. But actually, just look at this, it is quite interesting because if you look at that on the left hand, normal flights, all the flights, you can get an app that allows you to look at this if you're that way inclined. But on the right hand side, you can see that actually Switzerland didn't close its airspace. So it's quite interesting. We don't always, it's not in the European Union, although it's in the European Economic Area. So European airspace was cut down, and of course there's significant economic damage. So, and I'm going to just close with this last slide. So what did we learn from this? And the first thing is, it was not easy to gather the evidence, scientific evidence, to allow us to provide advice, very effective advice on this, because it involved very many scientific disciplines. So there was the volcanology, the geology, there was atmospheric physics, engineering, economics, all sorts of other things involved. So it was trying to get all of that together. And I would just highlight, and again, because I'm from the UK, in the UK there's a group called the SAGE group, which is Scientific Advice to Governments in Emergencies. And this is incredibly useful at bringing together all of these disciplines. And I think now we know that in response to this, we have to have a mechanism to quickly bring in disciplines and to allow people to contribute to coming up with effective options for the people who carry the can, who are our government and our ministers. We have to give them effective options. They will take the decision at the end of the day, but we are, I think it's an important role for us to do. Modelling is very important, but actually one of the problems with modelling is a number of the airlines were saying, yeah, it's a model, but we need to see some data. And for that reason, we sent up a number of experimental or scientific analysis flights to be able to gather real data to understand what was happening. So using research planes. And then what you have to do is tell people what are the safe ash concentrations to fly. And these guidelines have now been developed and put in place in 2012, which is handy for a reason I'm going to say in a minute. Politics, in this case, applied the precautionary principle initially. And actually, it's always very easy to talk in retrospect, but I think they did the right thing because we didn't have enough information initially. And I think it was maybe better to err on the side of safety, so using the precautionary principle. Others might disagree with me on that. It was very difficult for us in Europe to have a coordinated response because we don't have one airspace. We have lots of airspaces of different member states. And so it was quite difficult. This is something that there is a real passion to move towards, to have a single airspace over Europe, but we don't have that. So we had the different nationalities, difficult to get them to have a coordinated response, as I showed you. But communication was important because I know that when government ministers in Scotland were talking about closing airspace and the disruption it was causing, there were very angry responses coming from the audience, and I mean the broad audience of stakeholders, and they were very angry. You should do something about this. We don't, why is this happening, and so on. And it was a very unhelpful atmosphere. But when a chief scientific advisor spoke to the people and explained just sort of, really, I just went over the issues I raised, people sort of thought, okay. So knowing what the information is, having it translated for them by someone they trusted, I think was very helpful. And also, it raised awareness of societal vulnerabilities and how we might prepare in the future. So are we prepared? And what I'm saying, it's quite handy, we have new guidelines and so on. You know that there is another volcano, which is, in the process of a lot of at least seismic activity. Barababunga, maybe. I haven't got that one quite right. I'm better with Eyjafjallajökull. Anyway, so in this particular one, so this is from the Icelandic Met Office site, there's a lot of seismic activity, and it does look as if there is now magma flowing from the volcano in this case. But what we should be sure of is that we'll be in a much better position to understand what ash concentrations we can tolerate. The good news, at least yesterday, was that the airflow was actually going from Iceland towards Spitsbergen. So